Top 10 most overpowered specs in WoW. This list will list classes throughout WoW's history, not just what it's like currently. Now, what constitutes an overpowered spec? Well, mainly bugs, overtuning, or oversights into how certain abilities would mesh with each other. Number 10. Early Wrath DKs. All three specs didn't matter. As Blizzard's first hero class, they really wanted to feel more powerful than the others, and did a damn good job at it. A self-res on dying, Glyph of Death and Decay, which acted as a quasi-perma-stun, a spammable instant root, high damage, stacking improved blood presences, low cooldowns on big defensive cooldowns, dots that removed haunts. The list goes on and on. Early Wrath DKs are only number 10 on this list because, quite frankly, I've covered them many times in my other videos. But I'll also be covering additional times certain classes where OP has honorable mentions, like with DKs in patch 4.3. When Blizzard changed Vengeance to stack more quickly to help tanks get threat at the start of fights. This led to Blood DKs being able to pretty much solo people 2v1 in arenas with high damage output, along with healing. They later changed it so that Vengeance just can't stack in PvP. Now number 9, Presence of Mind Pyro Mages. Back in the day, when Pyroblast still had a 6-second cast time, Arcane Mages would combo Presence of Mind, Arcane Power, a Spell Power Trinket, and Pyroblast to one-shot low-geared players, and just do a shit ton of damage to anyone else. Number 8, BC Resto Shamans. In the Burning Crusade, Shamans were king of HPS, just as long as you stacked in P5 and knew how to use downranked Chain Heal. Chain Heal spam was pretty much all Shamans did. Well, that and Bloodlust, because Bloodlust didn't have a sated debuff and could be chain casted, but they could still spam Chain Heal and never ran out of mana, and Chain Heal healed for a ton. Also, honorable mentions were Vanilla Enhancement Shamans. They could one-shot players if the stars aligned and your Wind Furies procced off each other, because that used to be possible. Number 7, the Glorious Disc Priests, from Wrath to Miss. In Wrath, Disc Priest could spam bubbles on the entire raid without running out of mana, and easily top the healing charts. But, to be fair though, towards the end of Wrath no healers were ever run out of mana. But Disc was arguably the best. Preventing damage before it goes out was, and still is, a huge deal in healing, and Disc Priests were the only class that could bubble back then. Come Kata, Disc were given their very own cooldown, Power Word Barrier, which, on a 2-minute cooldown, reduced all damage by 30% for everyone underneath it. With enough Disc Priests in your raid, you could just straight up ignore raid mechanics if you stack them back to back smartly. Then come Miss. Blizzard killed bubble spamming back in Kata, nerfed Barrier to be more in line with other raid-wide cooldowns, but gave Priest Spirit Shell, which, when activated, turned all of the Priest heals for the next 15 seconds into a bubble instead. With enough Mastery stacking, you could ignore raid mechanics again with the raid-wide Super Bubbles while never run out of mana, just as long as you had a Shaman and an on-you Spirit Trinket to take advantage of Rapture procs. Number 6, SLSL BC Warlocks, or Soul Link Siphon Life Warlocks. These Warlocks went about halfway down the talent tree for Demo and Affliction, so I guess they'd be counted as hybrid Demo Affliction locks. Siphon Life was a dot that healed you every time it ticked, so all Warlocks had to do was put Siphon Life and all their other dots on everything and spam Fear, since Fear also had a lot higher damage threshold to break back then, and just do massive amounts of damage and healing simultaneously. Honorable mentions for Black Book Warlocks. An item that dropped in vanilla called the Black Book increased the damage and armor of your demon by 100% for 30 seconds, and allowed your imp to solo people in duels. During BC pre-patch, when Warlocks were given the Fel Guard for the first time, it was a bit overtuned and could solo other players. Early Miss Destro locks could 1 to 2 shot players with Chaos Bolt, and infinitely CC people if they sacked their succubus and gained its channel Seduce ability, which acted as a quasi-stun. Once it hit full DRs, you could then Fear until that reached full DRs, and then switch back to Seduce and repeat. Number 5, Beta WoW Fury Warriors. That's right, Beta. There's a pretty famous story about this, so hear me out. In Beta, people were QQing about how bad Fury Warriors were and how they needed buffs. In comes this player named Indalamar, who said, if anything, Fury Warriors were overpowered and needed a nerf. Then he released a video of himself chain-killing mobs crazy fast with a combination of Bloodthirsty, which was an ability you could use only after dealing a killing blow, which had a guaranteed chance to crit, and Flurry, which increased your haste by 35% for the next 3 attacks after it crit. It's worth noting, this was only overpowered because it could chain-kill mobs far faster than anything in the game at that point, which was kind of a big deal back then. Blizzard then promptly nerfed that and hired the guy who posted the video. Honorable mentions, a one-night bug in vanilla where warriors got one extra talent point than everyone else, which allowed them to take both Mortal Strike and Death Wish. Mortal Strike was already scaling pretty high, so a 20% damage boost for 30 seconds led to some fun one-shots in PvP. In BC, with the right mace weapon and arm spec, warriors could randomly stun quite frequently and were pretty well known as mace stun warriors in PvP, and were very annoying. Number 4. BC Hunters one-button macro. Hunters could top the DPS charts by literally pushing one button all raid. Well, two kinda. They still did need to pop cooldowns like normal non-one-button smashing plebs. In Cataclysm, early level hunters with heirlooms could one-shot cloth thieves in low-level battlegrounds with aim shot, since aim shot hit super hard and had a 75% increased chance to crit on targets above 80% health. In early Miss, Stampede was bugged, and instead of only doing 25% normal damage in PvP, it was doing its full 100. This was akin to letting DKs use pre-nerfed Army of the Dead in arenas. Number 3. Avoidance Cap Tanks. Near the end of both BC and Wrath, tanks were nearing the avoidance cap because the gear from ICC and Sunwell just gave them too much of it. Although it seemed to be an intentional design by Blizzard at one point, as Illidan's Shear, which reduced the tank's health by 60%, needed to be avoided, which could be accomplished with warrior tanks making proper usage of shield block and good gear, since you need 101.8% avoidance for Shear to never hit. And since tanks were hitting the avoidance cap before the last raid tier, they added a zone-wide buff to Sunwell that gave bosses and mobs an additional 5% chance to hit and a 20% chance to not be dodged, all because Blizzard screwed up tank scaling. And then in ICC, the very same thing happened again, so they put out the Chill of the Throne debuff, which was almost identical to Sunwell Radiance. Of course, the avoidance cap tanks aren't really a spec, but rogue tanks could actually hit 100% avoidance just through dodge in BC, with high dodge and agility gear and the right talent points. Speaking of rogues, number 2, the gearless rogue in vanilla PvP. In one-on-one, a rogue could pretty much just perma-stun you until they slowly killed you with their abilities. Obviously, having gear would make the rogues do more damage, but some of the rogues' abilities didn't really scale all that well with gear and had high base damage. Plus, diminishing returns weren't a thing in vanilla, neither were PvP durations on CCs. In BC, rogues also had their very own mace stun spec, which was just as annoying and OP as the warriors, and arguably more so since rogues attack faster. Their exposed armor around the same time used to reduce target's armor by a fixed amount instead of a percentage like it did later, allowing rogues to make clothies have 0 armor. In Wrath, sub-rogues had a talent called Honor Among Thieves, which gave them a combo point every time someone in their party crit. The thing is though, there wasn't a cooldown on how many combo points you could get at once, so rogues were refilling their combo point bars as soon as they could use them. And around the same time in early Wrath, Rogue's AoE ability Fan of Knives would interrupt every time it hit, allowing rogues to essentially spam an AoE interrupt. It also hit decently hard. In Cataclysm, sub-rogues could grab Shadow Step at level 10 and one-shot clothies with ambush and low-level BGs. This was around the same time hunters were one-shotting people with aim shot. Cataclysm was just not a friendly place to PvP in early levels. And finally, number 1, Paladins. Back when Prot Pallies were given Shield of Righteousness for the first time, both ranks of the abilities had separate cooldowns and did near identical damage, since the damage was based largely on block rating. This little bug allowed Prot Pallies to do quite a bit of damage as tanks. During the Wrath pre-patch, Red Pallies got major buffs and nearly every ability they had did straight up holy damage instead of physical, allowing even Pallies and Greens to one-shot people. Around the end of vanilla, the famous Wreck Bomb happened, where a Pally stacked the ability Wrecking on himself hundreds of times over to one-shot a world boss at level. In Cataclysm, for a short time after a hotfix, Seal of Truth was bugged and repeatedly reapplied itself over and over, allowing a lot of guilds to get their first heroic kills in Dragon Soul. Since it happened after the World Firsts were already over, and only lasted about 5 hours, it went largely unnoticed. No boss kills were taken away from players who used the bug, because you didn't have to do anything outside of your normal rotation to trigger it. Number 1 really should have been DKs, considering how strong they were and for how long, but Pallies were second best class around the same time, so I think it kinda evens out. You might be noticing I only didn't mention 2 classes on this list, Monks and Druids. They did both have their moments of fame though. In early Myths, Monks healers were the best healers for a short time, and Brewmaster tanks were the best all expansion. Druids had insane dodge values compared to all other tanks, and always ran into the issue of nearly hitting the armor cap during the end of expansions. Resto Druids were very good for hard fights that required a ton of movement and healing, and Beast and BC PvP healing. When Star Surge was first introduced for Boomkins, it was overtuned and hit very hard. Thorns was overtuned in the Kata pre-patch and could kill rogues just on its own. Balanced Druids had a brief period in BC where the Trents would aggro pretty much every mob within 40 yards onto their target, and Kitty Druids just go through periods of high damage, now being one of them in PvP. Alright, and that's the end of the video. If you want to watch more of my videos, I have like 10 other channels, link in the description in the middle of the screen, right next to the Patreon button.